At my son's wedding reception, 150 guests were raising their glasses while his new wife smiled beside him like the perfect bride. Then, in the middle of the celebration, my son wrapped an arm around my shoulder and whispered, "Dad, call the lawyer." Right now, 5 words, no explanation. My stomach tightened as I realized the woman I had just welcomed into our family might be hiding something dangerous. I kept smiling for the photographs, but after 30 years as a homicide detective, my mind was already quietly building a trap of its own. Before we begin, I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I love knowing who's in this community with me. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And one quick note. This story contains some fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but everything it teaches you is worth keeping. The October light over the Columbia River Gorge was the kind that made you believe the world was generous. Golden and warm, it poured through the tall windows of Gorge View Ranch, catching the crystal glasses on every table, scattering small rainbows across the white linen. Outside, the trees along the riverbank had gone the color of fire, amber, copper, deep red, and the hills beyond Hood River rolled green and gold all the way to the sky. I sat at the front table in a suit I had not worn since Margaret's funeral, and I thought she would have cried at this. She would have pressed a tissue to her eyes and pretended she wasn't crying. And Matthew would have teased her, and she would have laughed and cried harder. That was how Margaret was. She felt everything at full volume. But Margaret was gone 4 years now, and I was the only Sullivan at the front table, sitting straight back, the way retired detectives do, watching my son get married. Matthew looked good. He stood at the front of the room in a navy suit, his dark hair combed back, his shoulders squared. He was nervous, I could tell, because he kept adjusting his left cuff link the same way he used to fidget with his watch strap before a high school baseball game. But he was smiling, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Victoria stood beside him in ivory lace, her dark hair pinned up with small white flowers. She was beautiful, no question about it. The kind of beautiful that made people in the room glance at her twice and then lean toward each other and whisper something approving. She held Matthew's hand with both of hers and kept her eyes on his face like he was the only person in the building. 150 guests filled the room. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, people I recognized from Matthew's years growing up in Hood River, people I had never seen before in my life. Friends of Tarara's, she had said, consultants, former classmates, colleagues from Seattle. They looked polished and at ease, the way people do when they have practiced being comfortable in rooms like this. I lifted my champagne glass and told myself to feel what I was supposed to feel. The ceremony ended just after 5. The caterers moved through the room with trays of appetizers, and the DJ settled into something soft and instrumental. And the guests rose from their chairs and began the easy migration toward the bar and toward each other that happens at every reception the moment the formal part is over. Victoria's maid of honor clinked her glass and called for attention. She gave a toast that made the room laugh in the right places and go quiet in the right places. And then Victoria raised her own glass and said something about Matthew being the man she had been waiting her whole life to find, and I watched my son's face go soft and full in a way that made my chest ache with something I could not quite name. Then it was over and the room erupted in applause and glasses touched glasses and people hugged each other and the DJ brought the music up. I was reaching for my glass when Matthew appeared at my elbow. He put his arm around my shoulder the way sons do at weddings, the easy half hug that looks like celebration. He leaned close, his cheek almost touching mine, his voice dropping to barely above a breath. "Dad." His lips barely moved. His eyes were fixed on the room ahead of us, still smiling for anyone watching. "Call the lawyer right now." My hand tightened around the champagne flute. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes forward, kept the expression on my face exactly where it was. Pleasant, proud, a father at his son's wedding. 30 years as a homicide detective in Portland had given me one skill above all others: the ability to absorb a shock without letting it reach my face. I used every bit of that training now. Matthew squeezed my shoulder once released it and turned toward a group of his coworkers who were waving him over. He laughed at something one of them said and raised his glass and walked away. And to anyone in that room, he looked like a groom enjoying his own reception. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I set my champagne down carefully on the nearest table. I turned slowly, casually, and let my gaze travel across the room the way I used to sweep a crime scene. Nothing frantic, nothing focused, just open and absorbing everything at once. Victoria was near the windows talking with two women. I didn't recognize her hand resting lightly on one woman's arm. Her head tilted in that way she had of making whoever she was speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. She was laughing at something. Her teeth were very white, her eyes were bright. I had looked at Victoria Lawson 100 times in the 18 months she had been part of Matthew's life. I looked at her now the way I used to look at suspects. Something cold and certain settled into the center of my chest. The same feeling I had learned to trust in interrogation rooms, in dark parking lots, in courtrooms where everything looked clean on the surface and nothing was. It was not panic. It was not grief. It was the particular stillness that comes when a man who has spent 3 decades reading people finally allows himself to read what he has been refusing to see. I picked up my phone. I pulled up Cynthia Montgomery in my contact's family attorney 20 years. The woman who had helped Margaret and me set up the estate, the accounts, everything we had built over a lifetime. My thumb hovered over her name. The room buzzed around me. Someone touched my arm and congratulated me. I smiled and said, "Thank you." Someone else took a photograph. I held my expression. Then I stepped toward the hallway that led to the side exit and I pressed call. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I stood in the corridor, the music muffled behind the closed door, the October cold seeping in from the windows, and I listened to Cynthia's recorded voice ask me to leave a message. Cynthia. My voice came out steady. I was almost surprised. "It's Richard Sullivan. I need you to call me back tonight. It's about Matthew. It's urgent." I ended the call. I stood in the empty hallway for 10 seconds, breathing slowly, the way I used to breathe, before I walked into a building I wasn't sure was safe. Then I straightened my jacket, put my phone in my pocket, and walked back into the reception. Victoria was crossing the room toward Matthew. She reached him, slipped her hand into his, tilted her head up to say something in his ear. Matthew smiled and nodded. I picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray and raised it toward them. When Victoria glanced my way, she smiled at me, warm, radiant. A new daughter-in-law smiling at her father-in-law on the happiest day of her life. I smiled back. Neither of us looked away first. The side door of Gorgeview Ranch opened onto a narrow stone path that ran along the edge of the property, and the Columbia River wind hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of water and pine and the particular loneliness of autumn evenings in the gorge. I had told the table nearest me that I needed some air. Nobody questioned it. Fathers of the groom were allowed small disappearances. I walked to the far end of the path where a low stone wall separated the venue grounds from the hillside dropping toward the river, and I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets looking out at the water going dark in the fading light. And I tried to organize what was happening inside my chest into some things that made sense. My phone buzzed. Cynthia Montgomery returning my call. Richard. Her voice was careful. In 20 years she had learned to read my tone the same way I had learned to read suspects. "Talk to me." "Matthew said something to me tonight," I said. "At the reception, he told me to call you right now." Those were his words. What exactly did he say? "Call the lawyer right now." 4 words, Cynthia. He was smiling for the room the whole time he said it. There was a pause, not a long one. Cynthia did not waste time on long pauses. "Has something happened with the accounts?" "I don't know yet. I don't know anything yet. That's why I'm standing outside in the cold, instead of watching my son dance with his wife." "Don't confront her," Cynthia said immediately. "Not tonight. Not until you know what you're dealing with. Get me something concrete first, then we talk." "I know how this works, Cynthia. I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." Another pause shorter. "Call me tomorrow morning. Early." I put the phone back in my pocket and stood there a moment longer. The river wind pulling at my jacket. The sound of the reception leaking faintly through the venue walls. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses. 30 years as a homicide detective. I had walked into burning buildings, into rooms where men held guns with shaking hands, into hospitals where families were waiting to hear news that would break them open. I had learned very early that the worst moments rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly dressed as ordinary evenings, and you did not know what they were until you were already standing in the middle of them. Margaret had told me that once in the kitchen of our house in Hood River on a Tuesday night, when I had come home late again and she was cleaning up dinner alone. She said it with her back to me, rinsing a plate, her voice tired but not angry. "Rich, you spent 30 years reading criminals. Don't stop reading people just because you retired." I had laughed. I had kissed the back of her neck and told her she was the only person I needed to read anymore. She had turned around and looked at me with those gray eyes that saw everything and said, "I mean it." I had not taken it seriously enough. That was the truth I had been carrying for 4 years. And standing on that stone path in the October dark, I felt its full weight pressing down on me like a hand between my shoulder blades. I thought about the first time Matthew brought Victoria home, 14 months ago. November, the trees bear the Hood River property, wrapped in early winter. She had arrived in a dark green coat, carrying a bottle of Oregon Pino that was neither too expensive nor too cheap. And she had shaken my hand with both of hers and said, "Mr. Sullivan, Matthew talks about this place like it's the most important place in the world." Now I understand why. My hand had registered something. Then her grip firm and practiced the kind of handshake you learn rather than inherit. But I had told myself I was being a suspicious old detective who didn't know how to turn it off. I had told myself that 14 times over 14 months. Every time Victoria asked a question that landed a little too precisely on the subject of assets or accounts or what the Hood River property was worth these days, I had told myself the same thing. She's just curious. She's just getting to know the family. You're projecting. The music inside swelled briefly, then settled. Someone laughed loudly enough that I heard it through the walls. I turned and walked back inside. Matthew was on the dance floor with Victoria, her head against his shoulder, his hand on her back. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had everything he wanted. But when he lifted his eyes and found me across the room, I saw it the tightness around his jaw, the carefully controlled tension in his shoulders. That had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with endurance. My son had been performing since before the ceremony even started. I went back to my table and picked up my champagne and drank half of it standing up. Tyler Brooks, Matthew's best friend since college, dropped into the chair beside mine. His tie loosened, his face flushed from the dance floor and the open bar. "She's perfect for him, isn't she, Mr. C?" Tyler grinned and clinked his glass against mine without asking. I knew it the second I introduced them. Some things you just know. I looked at Tyler. He was 29 years old and genuinely happy and completely without guile. And the word "introduced" landed in the center of my chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Remind me," I said, keeping my voice easy. "How did that happen again? You two meeting?" Tyler leaned back in his chair, happy to tell the story. Networking event in Seattle about 2 years ago. One of those tech-adjacent finance things, you know, the kind. I almost didn't go. It was a Wednesday night. I had work in the morning, but I got this email about the venue and it sounded cool. So he shrugged. Victoria walked up and introduced herself. We talked for like an hour, super sharp, super easy to talk to. When she mentioned she was new to Portland, I told her she had to meet Matthew. "Who put on the event?" I asked. Tyler's brow creased slightly. "You know, I actually can't remember. Some organization I'd never heard of before. I think I got the email through LinkedIn." He tilted his head. "Why?" I squeezed his arm and smiled. "No reason, just like knowing how stories start." Tyler laughed and pushed back his chair to rejoin the dance floor, and I sat very still with my champagne glass in my hand, running back through everything he had just told me. An email from an organization he had never heard of, a venue that sounded appealing, a woman who approached him and spent an hour being easy to talk to, and then mentioned she was new to Portland, and waited for Tyler to do exactly what Tyler would always do, offered to introduce her to someone. My jaw tightened until I could feel the pressure in my back teeth. I found Matthew with my eyes across the room. He was laughing at something Victoria had said, and she was watching his face while he laughed. and her expression was warm and attentive, and perfectly, flawlessly right. Too right. The same way everything about her had always been too right. The reception would go another 2 hours. I had 2 hours to hold this inside my chest without letting it reach my face. I picked up my glass. I drank the rest of the champagne. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and went to congratulate the bride and groom, smiling with every muscle I had. We found our way to the back of the property without planning it. The kind of movement that happens between two people who have learned over a lifetime that some conversations cannot happen in rooms full of other people. The venue had a storage building set back from the main hall, a low wooden structure half hidden by ornamental cedars. Matthew led me there without a word, his hand briefly touching my elbow as we slipped out into the dark. Behind us, through two sets of walls, the reception hummed on best from the speakers, a ripple of laughter, the world where everything was still supposed to be fine. Out here, the October air was cold enough to see our breath. Matthew turned to face me. The string lights from the venue cast just enough glow to see his expression, and what I saw made my stomach drop in a way that 30 years of homicide work had never managed to prepare me for. My son's face on his wedding night was the face of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. 3 weeks ago, he said, his voice rough, like he had been storing those words in a very tight place. It happened 3 weeks ago, Dad. 3 weeks. The math hit me like a door swinging open into my face through the dress fittings and the rehearsal dinner planning. And the moment he stood at that altar this afternoon and smiled at the woman who was doing this to him. Tell me, I said everything. Start from the beginning. Matthew pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum like he was trying to hold something in. Then he started talking. 3 weeks ago, Sunday afternoon, Victoria had gone to the grocery store. Matthew's laptop battery died without warning, and Victoria's laptop was sitting open on the counter. He used it without thinking the way couples do when they have decided they have nothing to hide from each other. The screen that came up was not a browser. It was a spreadsheet Victoria had left open. The file name sat at the top in plain black letters. Chalahan Acetlation Dexless. Less, Matthew said, and his voice cracked on the last syllable. I thought it was a mistake, some client file, a coincidence. And then I looked at column A. He told me what was in it, column by column. The Hood River property, my retirement accounts, the savings account he and Victoria had opened 2 weeks after the engagement. $180,000 of Matthew's money. Every number precise, every asset listed with a value accurate enough to mean someone had done serious research. The last column was a timeline 30 days post-ceremony. At the top, one note before legal intervention, specifically protections under California Welfare and Institutions Code. SIC Fine 610030 for elder financial abuse can be initiated, Matthew said. The cold air between us felt suddenly thinner. I closed the laptop, he continued, voice dropping lower. Put it back exactly where it was. Went into the bathroom, ran the faucet, sat on the edge of the tub, and thought I was going to be sick. His jaw worked. And then Victoria came home with the groceries and called out my name. And I walked out of that bathroom and helped her put the food away and kissed her on the cheek. And she asked me what I wanted for dinner. A sound came out of me low and involuntary. My chest felt like something was pulling the ribs inward from both sides. Matthew. My voice came out harder than I intended. You should have called me the moment you saw it. His eyes came up to mine, and what was in them hit me harder than anything he had said. I didn't know if you'd believe me, Dad. The words landed in my sternum like a fist. I stood in the cold October dark and heard the truth in what he had just said, and I felt the weight of every baseball game I had missed, every dinner I had come home late to, every time Margaret had covered for me without telling him she was doing it. I had not been the kind of father a son calls first when everything falls apart. I put my hand on his shoulder and gripped harder than I meant to. Who is JV? Matthew shook his head, frustration and fear moving across his face at the same time. There was a contact in her phone with those initials. I saw it once 2 months ago. Didn't think anything of it then. Now I can't stop thinking about it. Does she know you saw the spreadsheet? No, absolute certainty. I've been acting like everything is normal for 3 weeks. Every morning, every night, every time she talked about the wedding, the honeymoon, our life together. His voice went tight, the whole time thinking, Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's an explanation I haven't thought of. I looked at my son, this man who had smiled through every vow this afternoon, danced and laughed and performed happiness for 150 people while carrying this alone, and felt something shift inside me, deep and permanent. "You are not wrong," I said, "and you are not alone anymore." Matthew's face contracted sharply. He pressed his mouth flat, eyes going bright, and nodded once hard, using the motion to push something back down. "We go back in there," I said. "Finish the reception. Act like nothing happened. Can you do that?" He cleared his throat, squared his shoulders. "I've done it for 3 weeks. I know," I said. "I know you have." We stood another moment in the dark behind the cedar trees, the reception going on without us 50 yards away, and I thought about Margaret, her son, holding himself together on his wedding night, her husband finally showing up when it mattered. "Dad," Matthew said, "what if she finds out we know?" I felt the old certainty settle into my bones, the thing that had never failed me in 30 years. "Then we make sure," I said, "that we find out everything first." Matthew and I walked back into the reception separately. Him first, me 2 minutes later, the way partners used to re-enter a room during a surveillance operation, so nobody clocked the coordination. Old habits. The DJ had moved into something with a stronger beat, and the dance floor had filled up, and the energy in the room had shifted the way it does at receptions when the champagne has been flowing for 2 hours and the formal obligations are behind everyone. And what remains is just the pure animal pleasure of celebration. I collected a fresh glass of water from the bar. No more alcohol tonight, not when I needed every nerve sharp, and moved to the edge of the room where I could put my back to the wall and see the whole space at once. Victoria was near the windows. She was talking with 2 women I had met briefly, during the cocktail hour, friends from Seattle, she had said. And she was doing that thing she did, where her whole body angled toward whoever was speaking, as if that person were the only one in the room worth listening to. Her glass was raised, her laugh came easily. She touched one woman's arm at precisely the right moment in the conversation. I watched her the way I used to watch a subject during a long surveillance. Not with suspicion written on my face, not with any visible focus at all, just with that loose, absorbing attention that takes in everything and betrays nothing. What I saw was a woman moving through a room the way someone moves through a room they have already memorized. Not exploring, not discovering, confirming. Victoria broke away from the 2 women and crossed the floor toward me, weaving through the crowd with a smile already arranged on her face, and my jaw tightened by a fraction, and then relaxed before she covered the last 10 feet. "Are you hiding over here?" she said, and her voice carried exactly the right amount of affectionate teasing, the tone a new daughter-in-law uses with a father-in-law she is working to win over. "Old detective habit," I said. "Can't enjoy a party unless I can see all the exits." She laughed. It was a good laugh, genuine, sounding warm. Matthew warned me about that. She tilted her champagne glass toward me in a small toast. "I'm so glad you're here, Richard. I mean that. Matthew needs you here tonight." "I'm glad to be here," I said. "Nowhere else I'd rather be." We looked at each other over the rims of our glasses, and I smiled and she smiled, and neither one of us blinked first. "He talks about you constantly, you know," Victoria said. She lowered her glass, and her expression shifted into something softer, more careful, about how much he admires you, about how hard it was losing his mom. She paused, and I saw her eyes go slightly liquid at the edges. The micro-expression of someone's about to say something calibrated for impact. "I just want you to know that I'm going to take care of him the way Margaret would have wanted." Margaret's name in her mouth. Something moved through my chest, cold and fast like water finding a crack in concrete. "That means a great deal to me, Victoria," I said, and I kept my voice level and warm, and I looked her directly in the eye, and I thought, "You have done your research. You know exactly what to say and when to say it." She squeezed my forearm once, brief and practiced, and then Matthew appeared at her shoulder and slipped his arm around her waist, and she turned to him with her whole face lighting up. And I stood there and watched my son smile back at the woman who was planning to rob him in 30 days. I needed air again, but I did not take it. I needed to stay in this room and keep watching. I moved along the wall toward the back tables, and that was when I saw him. He was sitting alone at the last table on the far right, the one nearest the emergency exit, the one that had been listed on the seating chart as belonging to a couple named Morrison who had apparently not shown up. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dark suit, no tie hair starting to gray at the temples. He was not eating. He was not drinking. He was doing what I was doing, watching the room, except his eyes kept returning to Victoria. My pulse kicked up by exactly one notch. I did not look at him directly. I picked up a canope from a passing tray and ate it, and looked at the dance floor and let my peripheral vision do the work. The way 30 years of police work had trained me to gather information without telegraphing interest. The man at the far table glanced once at his phone. His expression did not change. Then he looked up and his gaze moved across the room and landed for just a moment on me. I looked away first, deliberately, giving him nothing. Tyler materialized at my elbow with the enthusiasm of someone who had been at the open bar for the better part of 2 hours. "Mr. C, you have got to get out on that floor. Matthew's been asking where you went." "In a minute," I said, keeping my voice easy. "Go tell him I'm getting another drink." Tyler clapped me on the shoulder and disappeared into the crowd, and I turned back toward the far table. The chair was empty. I set my glass down on the nearest surface and walked toward the emergency exit, unhurried, just a man stretching his legs, and pushed through the door into the parking lot beyond. The night air hit me cold and sharp. The lot was half full, the cars sitting quiet under the overhead lights. I walked 2 rows out and stopped. A man in a dark suit was sitting in a gray sedan 6 cars down from the exit. His window was down despite the cold. His phone was pressed to his ear. He was speaking low and fast, and even from where I stood, I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. Not casual, not relaxed, but the concentrated alertness of someone reporting in. He turned his head and saw me standing there. For 2 full seconds, neither of us moved. Then he started the car, reversed out of the space in one smooth motion, and drove toward the lot exit without hurrying. The sedan turned right onto the highway and disappeared into the dark. I stood in the parking lot with the cold coming off the river and my heart beating hard and steady in my chest, and I memorized everything I could. Gray sedan, late model, Oregon plates, the first 3 characters, a dent on the rear passenger door. I took out my phone and typed what I had into my notes app. Then I went back inside and found Matthew on the dance floor and danced badly for one song because my son needed to see his father having a normal evening. And I smiled through every beat of it while my mind ran and ran and ran. Clear's throat did not sleep on the drive home from Hood River. That is not unusual for me. I have never been a man who could let his mind go quiet simply because the day was over. Margaret used to say, I processed out loud in my sleep, muttering case details into the pillow at 2 in the morning, and she had learned to elbow me without waking either of us. After she was gone, I had nobody to elbow me, and the muttering had turned into lying flat on my back in the dark, with my eyes open, running through things that needed running through. Tonight there was plenty. The drive from Gorge View Ranch back to Hood River took 40 minutes on empty roads. I drove the speed limit exactly the way I always do when my mind is occupied with something more important than the car hands. Steady eyes forward, everything else running underneath the gray sedan. The man at the table, the way Tara had said Margaret's name. I pulled into my driveway at 11:43 and sat with the engine off looking at the house. Dark windows, apple trees casting long shadows across the gravel. The Hood River property in autumn always looked like a painting Margaret would have hung in the hallway. Melancholy and beautiful, the kind of thing that made your chest hurt if you looked too long. I went inside. The kitchen light was on. I had left it on before the wedding, hating the idea of coming home to complete darkness, something I had started doing 6 months after Margaret died, and never stopped. I dropped my keys on the counter and stood in my wedding suit in the yellow kitchen light and just breathed. Cynthia had said, "Don't confront her, get me something concrete." I poured 2 fingers of bourbon I did not drink and carried it to the small office off the back of the house, the room that had been Margaret's project room when she was alive, full of fabric samples and gardening catalogs and the organized chaos of a woman who had 17 things going at once. Now it was my office. The chaos was gone. The room was neat in the way. Rooms become neat when only one person uses them, and that person does not have enough to fill the space. On the corner of the desk sat a framed photograph. Margaret in the apple orchard summer, her hair loose, laughing at something I had said from behind the camera. 3 years before she got sick, she looked like a woman completely at peace with everything that was already there. I sat down, looked at the photograph, then pulled open the bottom drawer. Margaret's old cell phone, a model 3 generations out of date. The screen cracked where she had dropped it in the garden the summer before her diagnosis. I had charged it once 2 years after she died, intending to clear it out, and then sat scrolling through her photos for 2 hours and put it back in the drawer without touching it again. I plugged it in and waited 4 minutes to power on. I entered the passcode, her birthday, the code she had never bothered to hide because she said she had nothing to hide, and the home screen appeared. A photograph of Matthew at his college graduation. I went to her messages and scrolled without knowing what I was looking for. The way detectives look when they do not yet know which piece of the puzzle is missing. Her sister, her book club friends, the texture of Margaret's daily life preserved in text. Then I found it, a thread with Brenda Wallace, Margaret's oldest friend since college. I scrolled until a date stopped me cold. October 4 years ago, 2 months before Margaret's first symptom. The message read, Brenda met Maddie's new girl tonight. Pretty too pretty, smiles too fast. Eyes don't match the smile. I don't know, maybe I'm just being an old woman. Rich didn't say anything either way. You know how he is. My hand tightened around the phone until I felt the cracked screen pressing into my palm. I read it again. Then I set the phone down very carefully and pressed both hands flat on the desk and felt my eyes burn with a heat that climbed fast from somewhere behind my sternum. Margaret had seen it 4 years ago one evening. She had seen what I had spent 18 months convincing myself I was not seeing. You told Brenda, I said out loud to the photograph, to whatever part of her might still be listening. Why didn't you tell me, Maggie? I knew why, even as I asked it. Because I would have dismissed it. Because Margaret had spent 34 years navigating the stubbornness of a man who trusted data over instinct, except when the instinct was his own. I kept scrolling. 3 weeks later, another message to Brenda. A photograph of a journal page. Margaret's handwriting cramped and careful the way it got when she was working something out. Matthew gives his whole heart too fast. I hope someday the person who receives it deserves it. The burning behind my eyes crested and broke. I sat in Margaret's old project room in my wedding suit at midnight, holding my dead wife's phone with both hands, and I cried the way men who have spent 30 years not crying finally do, without warning, without dignity, without any ability to stop it once it started. My shoulders shook, my breath came in hard and uneven. I pressed my fist against my mouth, and it helped nothing. She had known. She had put it in her journal, and she had died before she could do anything about it. When it was over, I sat very still. Then I wiped my face, took a breath that steadied somewhere in the middle, and picked up my phone. Hector Vargas answered on the second ring because Clear's throat. Hector Vargas had been answering my calls on the second ring since 1987, regardless of the hour. Rich graveled with sleep but alert underneath. What's wrong? I need a favor, I said. Off the books. A pause. The sound of him sitting up. Tell me, I need you to run a name. JV Julian Vance and trace a gray sedan late model Oregon plates. I read him the partial from the parking lot. This about Matthew's wedding. Yes. A longer pause. How bad? I looked at Margaret laughing in the apple orchard 3 years before everything changed. I don't know yet, I said. That's why I'm calling you at midnight. Hector Vargas arrived at 7:15 the next morning in the same battered Ford pickup he had been driving for 6 years, parking it at the same angle in my driveway, slightly crooked 2 feet from the fence post. The way a man parks when muscle memory takes over before the conscious mind gets involved. I had been up since 5. Coffee was made. The kitchen table was clear, and I had already been through the Hood River property files. Once titled Deeds Account Statements, everything I could lay my hands on, while the apple trees outside went from black to gray to the pale gold of early Sunday morning. Hector came through the back door without knocking, dropped his jacket over the chair and poured himself coffee without asking. 15 years of the same habits. He sat down and looked at my face. You slept maybe 2 hours, he said. 1, I said. What did you find? Hector pulled a folded print out from his shirt pocket, smoothed it flat on the table between us. I leaned forward and looked at the photograph in the upper left corner. The man from the wedding, same gray temples, same set to the jaw. St. Julian Vance, Hector said. 44 years old, paralegal for 11 years at a firm in Seattle Estate Planning and Trust Administration. Fired 3 years ago. Off record. He was caught falsifying probate documents in direct violation of California Penal Code. Section B70 for forgery. The firm let him go quietly rather than pursue charges. I studied the estate planning. I said, Contra administration, Hector said. The man knows exactly how money moves through a family when somebody dies or somebody gets married. He knows how to move assets in ways that look routine until they're already gone. My stomach tightened, and Victoria Lawson. Hector wrapped both hands around his mug. Born in Medford, Oregon 31 years ago, finance degree from University of Oregon. Worked 2 years at a wealth management firm in Portland, then left to go independent. He paused. The consulting business has no website, a classic structure used in dissipation of marital asset schemes. No registered clients, no income on record for the past 18 months, but I found transfers into a personal account. Irregular intervals about $4,000 a month. Source is an LLC registered in Nevada. Shell company. I set the print out down. Outside, the first real light was hitting the apple trees, turning the leaves soft, dusty gold. Sunday morning in Hood River. Margaret had loved Sunday mornings here. Coffee on the back porch, the Oregonian folded on the arm of her chair. I thought about her message to Beverly, smiles too fast. Eyes don't match the smile. How do Vance and Lawson connect, I asked. They share a father, Hector said, producing a second sheet. Different mothers raised separately. Father's name was Gerald Vance. Left Julian's mother when Julian was 9. Showed up in Medford, had Victoria with another woman. Left again when Victoria was 7, died in 2019. Left everything to a third family in Boise. Victoria and Julian were not mentioned in the will. Something settled in my chest. Not grief, not anger, but the particular weight that comes from understanding why something happened, even when it changes nothing about the damage done. They found each other, I said. DNA ancestry site 4 years ago. 4 years ago, the same year, Victoria apparently met Tyler at a networking event. That may not have been a networking event at all. The event Tyler went to, I said. The networking thing in Seattle, who organized it, already pulled it. Hector's chair scraped back slightly. Registered in Washington State as a professional development nonprofit. Filed paperwork 2 months before the event. Has held exactly 1 event since. The registered agent's mailing address is a UPS store in Bellevue. I turned from the window and looked at Hector across the kitchen. She built an entire event, I said slowly. To get Tyler to introduce her to Matthew. Hector met my eyes over his mug. That's what it looks like. I sat back down. My hands were flat on the table and I looked at them. The hands that had arrested Silas Thorne 8 years ago, that had shaken Tarara Lawson's hand 14 months ago. While I told myself I was being paranoid. Silas Thorne, I said. What do you have? Hector exhaled slowly. Released from Oregon State Correctional 26 months ago. Served 5 of 8 years good behavior. Clean on paper since release. He paused. But his wife has an LLC registered in Delaware that started making payments to a Nevada company 18 months ago. The Nevada company connects to Julian Vance's shell structure. The words landed like stones dropping into deep water. He funded it, I said. Thorne funded the whole operation. That's where the money trail points, Hector said carefully. I can't take this to anyone official yet, but the connections are there. The car, I said. Registered to an LLC and Portland plates match the partial you logged in the parking lot, which connects after 2 layers to Silas Thorne's wife. I stood up and walked to the window and back. Hector watched without saying anything. He had known me long enough to understand I sometimes needed to move before I could think clearly. He looked right at me. In that parking lot, I said. Julian saw me watching and he drove away, which means the timeline just got shorter. Hector set his mug down with a small, decisive sound. What do you want to do, Rich? I stopped pacing and looked at my old partner. This man who had shown up at my back door at 7 in the morning on a Sunday, without being asked, who had spent the night running names through systems he was not technically supposed to access, who had never once asked me to explain myself before deciding whether to help. I want to know everything I said. Every connection, every account, every piece of paper with Julian Vance's fingerprints on it. Hector nodded, stood, and picked up his printouts. At the back door, he stopped and turned. Richard. His voice dropped to the register he used when something mattered beyond the professional. How's Matthew holding up? The detective fell away, and what was underneath came through: just a father standing in his dead wife's kitchen, trying to protect his son from something he should have seen coming. He carried it alone for 3 weeks. Hector, I said without telling a soul. Hector's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. Kid's got more of you in him than you think, he said. Then he was gone. I stood alone in the kitchen with the morning light through the window and Margaret's handwriting on a photographed journal page, still vivid in my memory, and I reached for my phone and called Eleanor Croft for the very first time. Eleanor Croft answered on the second ring. Her voice was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, with a precision to it that told me she was someone who chose words carefully before releasing them. A journalist's voice, the kind that had learned to stay level when the story was anything but. Mr. Sullivan, she said, thank you for calling me back. You called me first, I said. Start from the beginning. A brief pause, not hesitation, just the pause of someone deciding where the beginning actually was. 2 years ago in Denver, my brother was seeing a woman named Olivia Jensen. They met at a charity event. She was a financial consultant, very polished, very attentive. She spent 4 months getting close to our family before he figured out what she was actually after. I walked to the kitchen window looking out at the apple trees. What was she after? My parents' estate. They're not wealthy by any national standard, Mr. Sullivan. But they own property in Cherry Creek worth about $2 million, and a retirement portfolio that my father spent 40 years building. Her voice tightened fractionally. Olivia had done her homework. She knew the numbers better than my brother did. How did he find out? He came home early from a work trip and found her on her laptop going through scanned copies of my parents' financial documents. Documents she had photographed during a family dinner 2 months earlier. A sharp exhale. She left that night. No confrontation, no explanation, just gone. Changed her number. The consulting firm she claimed to work for turned out to be a registered LLC with no employees and no actual clients. I turned away from the window. My jaw was tight enough that I could feel the pressure running up into my temples. You've been tracking her since. I'm an investigative journalist, Eleanor said simply. It's what I do when someone hurts my family. The words carried no drama. Just a flat, matter-of-fact quality that I recognized immediately, and the same tone I had used for 30 years when people asked me why I kept working cases that should have been closed. I found 3 other instances before yours. Different names, different states, same profile, single-man family with significant assets, daughter or son as the point of entry. The operation always involves a second person handling the financial architecture, someone with legal expertise. Julian Vance, I said. A silence that lasted exactly 1 second. You already have him. My investigator pulled him last night. Cashed paralegal estate law specialty, fired for falsifying probate documents in direct violation of California Penal Code. Section 470 for forgery 3 years ago. Half-sibling to Terrace and Claire through an absent father who left both of them with nothing. Eleanor let out a breath that carried something complicated in it. Relief and frustration compressed together. I've been trying to identify the second person for 18 months. Every time I got close, the paper trail went cold. Her voice sharpened with sudden energy. You have a name? A real name. Do you have a current address? My investigator is working on it. What I need from you right now is everything you have on the other instances, dates, locations, how close she got before it fell apart. Denver was the closest call before yours. The others she got less far, pulled out earlier, either because the target got suspicious or the financial access wasn't as deep as she needed. Eleanor paused. Your son's situation is different, Mr. Sullivan. The asset base is larger, the access mechanisms are more developed, and she's already married him. This is the furthest she has ever gotten. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and let that land. The furthest she had ever gotten, which meant everything Julian had built, every shell company, every legal mechanism, every carefully rehearsed document was aimed at this moment, this marriage, this family. Okay, there's something else, Eleanor said, and her voice dropped slightly. In Denver, I found a connection to a third party, a financial backer, Someone who was funding the operation in exchange for a cut of whatever was taken. I never identified him in Denver. The money trail went offshore before I could follow it. She paused, but the structure of the payments was distinctive. Irregular intervals, always through a Delaware LLC, always laundered through a Nevada intermediary first. Silas Thorne, I said, another silence longer this time. Who is Silas Thorne? Eleanor asked. And I heard the journalist in her voice sharpen into something urgent and focused. I told her. 8 years ago, the money laundering investigation, the arrest and conviction, the look Silas Thorne had given me across the courtroom before they led him away. You'll regret this, Sullivan. Eleanor was quiet for a moment after I finished. When she spoke, her voice was careful, in a way that told me she was working through implications in real time. If Thorne has been funding multiple operations across multiple states, this isn't just personal revenge, Mr. Sullivan. This is an organized financial crime network with severe penalties under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations RICO Act that changes what kind of legal response is available to you. I know, I said. How soon can you get to Hood River? Tuesday morning, she said without hesitation. I'm driving. I'll have everything laid out when you get here. I ended the call and set my phone on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment with both hands braced on the countertop, looking at the grain of the wood. Victoria Lawson had stood in this kitchen 14 months ago and complimented the apple orchard. She had asked Margaret's favorite question, what does Hood River look like in winter? And I had told her about the ice on the river and the way the bare apple trees looked like charcoal drawings against the snow. And she had listened with her full attention and said it sounded beautiful. She had been taking notes. I pushed off the counter and went back to the desk and pulled out a legal pad and wrote 3 names at the top of the page. Tarara Lawson, Julian Vance, Silas Thorne, 3 points of a triangle, and my son's life sitting in the middle of it. I started writing. Hector called at 6:30 that evening while I was standing in front of the refrigerator, trying to remember the last time I had eaten something that was not coffee. Silas Thorne, he said without preamble. I've been pulling threads all day, Rich. You need to hear this. I closed the refrigerator, went to the table, and sat down with a notepad. Go. Jack released from Oregon State Correctional 26 months ago. Served 5 of 8 good behavior model inmate, wrote a letter to the parole board about rehabilitation that his attorney later told a reporter was the most compelling document he had ever seen a client produce. Hector's voice was dry as gravel. The man knows how to perform sincerity. You should know that better than anyone. He looked me in the eye in that courtroom, I said, and told me I'd regret it. And then he spent 5 years in Salem, planning exactly how to make that true. Papers shuffling since release. Clean record, no violations, living modestly in the Pearl District, nothing that would draw attention from his parole officer. On paper, a retired businessman putting his past behind him. And off paper, his wife Cynthia's been busy. Hector exhaled. The Delaware LLC, the payment structure routed through Nevada. Cynthia Thorne is the registered agent. First transfer 18 months ago, $30. Zoos into a Nevada company, connecting directly to Julian Vance's financial structure. 2 more transfers after that, $25,000 and $30,000. $85,000 total. I wrote the numbers down. My hand was steady. The anger moving through me was not the hot, reactive kind. It was cold and deep. The kind that does not shake a hand. It just tightens it slowly and completely until nothing moves. He paid Julian to build the operation, I said. He paid Julian to build the operation, Hector confirmed. But here's what I didn't expect. The pause he uses when something landed hard before he could bring it to me. 3 months ago, Thorne had lunch at a restaurant in Northwest Portland. I have him on security footage. He was not alone. Who was with him? Julian Vance. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Hood River had gone fully dark, the apple trees invisible beyond the window. Just black sky pressing against the glass, 90 minutes across a table. Hector said, "This isn't just money changing hands through shell companies. Thorne is hands-on. He is managing this personally." I stood and walked to the window, not because there was anything to see, but because I could not sit still with what I was feeling. 8 years ago, I had walked into Silas Thorne's office on the 14th floor of a Pearl District building with a warrant in my hand. Thorne had been on the phone when we came in. He finished his call before acknowledging us, a small, deliberate demonstration of power I had noted and never forgotten. He had built a real estate empire on laundered money for 15 years before I caught the thread that unraveled it. Margaret had once said that when I was working a case, it was like living with someone physically present but mentally in another country. I had thought about that often in the 4 years since she died. How many evenings she had spent across the table from a man whose mind was somewhere else. How much of Matthew's childhood had been shaped by a father always just slightly out of reach. Rich Hector's voice through the phone. "You still with me? I'm here." I turned back to the table. Thorne knows our family well enough to architect this. The asset structure, our personal dynamics, everything. Someone gave him that information after he got out. I wrote Thorne's name on the pad and drew a line connecting it to Julian's. Who has that kind of access? That's the question I've been sitting with all day. Hector said, "Keep pulling." And Hector Julian was at the wedding. He saw me watching him. If he reports back to Thorne that I'm suspicious, the timeline accelerates. Yes. A pause. How much time do I have? I thought about the spreadsheet. 30 days post-ceremony. The wedding had been yesterday. 29 days, I said. At most, probably less. Hector was quiet a moment. Then his voice dropped to the register. "Rich, when Margaret died, you told me the worst thing was not getting to say goodbye, not getting to tell her what she meant." I stood very still at the table pen, loose in my fingers. "I remember," I said. "Matthew is still here," Hector said. "Whatever happens with all of this, he's still here." I looked at the legal pad, 3 names connected by lines, a triangle built on someone else's hatred for a job I had done right. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not letting them touch him." After I hung up, I went to the office and looked at Margaret's photograph. The apple orchard, the loose hair, the laugh. "He remembered us," I said to her. "All those years in a prison cell, he planned this, and I had no idea." My voice came out rough, and I did not smooth it. I should have taken it more seriously, Maggie. The day he looked at me in that courtroom. The room was quiet around me, the way rooms are when you talk to someone who cannot answer. I sat in that quiet and let it be what it was. Man in his late 60s in a house too quiet, making peace with what he had not seen in time. Then I called Cynthia Montgomery, 8:47 on a Sunday night. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Cynthia," I said, "who outside this family had access to the full estate documents, asset breakdown, account structures, everything in the last 3 years?" A pause, her voice sharpened. "Richard, why are you asking me that?" "Because Silas Thorne knew the exact numbers," I said. Somebody told him. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear her breathing. "I need to check something," she said finally. "Give me until tomorrow morning. Before I tell you what Eleanor Croft brought to my door that Tuesday morning, drop a comment with the number 9 so I know you're still with me." Because what she revealed changed everything I thought I understood about this woman, and a reminder some details ahead are shaped for storytelling purposes. If that's not for you, this is a good place to stop. Cynthia called at 7:52 the next morning, Monday, 4 days since the wedding. I was already at the kitchen table with coffee going cold beside me and the legal pad covered in notes from the night before. And when her name came up on the screen, my hand tightened around the phone before I even answered. "Talk to me," I said. 3 years ago," Cynthia said, and her voice had a careful, controlled quality that I recognized as the sound of a lawyer who had found something she wished she had not found. "My firm took on a junior associate, fresh out of law school. Strong references, excellent work. She assisted on 4 estate planning files over 8 months, including the full Sullivan estate documentation, account structures, property valuations, trust, instruments, everything." A breath. "She resigned abruptly 18 months ago. No notice, no forwarding contact. I assumed it was a better offer somewhere else." My chest tightened until I could feel the pressure between my shoulder blades. "Her name on her resume. Rebecca Tanner." Cynthia's voice went flat. "I ran it this morning through the Bar Association database. There is no Rebecca Tanner with those credentials. The law school she listed has no record of her. The previous firm she cited on her resume doesn't exist." I set my pen down on the table. Someone had placed a fake employee inside Cynthia's firm 18 months ago. Time to coincide with the start of the shell company payments to Julian. Time to give Thorne everything he needed about the Sullivan family finances before the operation moved into its next phase. She copied the files. I said she had full access. Cynthia said, and for the first time in 20 years, I heard something under her professional composure, a tightness that was close to guilt. Richard, I am so sorry. I should have run more rigorous background checks. I should have Cynthia. I cut her gently across the sentence. You are not responsible for what Silas Thorne built. Do you understand me? This is organized and professional, and it has been running for years. Report the false credentials to the Bar Association and keep everything you have found. I'm going to need it. A pause. What are you going to do? I'm going to end it, I said. Before it ends, Matthew. I set the phone down and sat for a moment with the weight of what I now understood pressing flat against my chest. Thorne had the numbers. He had always had the numbers. But numbers alone could not give him what he needed, a signature, a legal instrument. Someone inside the family with the standing to authorize a transfer. That was what Victoria was for. Not the intelligence, the access, the face that Matthew trusted, the hand that would hold the pen. Eleanor Croft arrived at my door at 10:15 Tuesday morning, 45 minutes earlier than she had estimated, driving a dark blue Honda Civic with a Denver parking permit still hanging from the rearview mirror. She was 34, I had guessed, from our phone call, and I was close. She was 36 with the particular look of someone who had spent years running toward difficult things rather than away from them. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a messenger bag, over one shoulder packed, full enough that the zipper strained. She shook my hand at the door, firm and brief. Eleanor Croft, she said. Thank you for having me. Richard Sullivan's, I said, come in. I had set up the kitchen table as a working surface. Hector's printouts on one side, my legal pad in the center, Margaret's photographed journal page in a clear sleeve in the corner because I had not been able to put it away. Eleanor looked at the setup without comment, dropped her bag onto a chair, and pulled out a battered accordion folder. Denver first, she said. She was not a woman who eased into things. 2 years ago, Olivia Jensen, one of Victoria's operating names, she targeted my brother at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital Denver. He's an architect. Our parents own property in Cherry Creek and a retirement portfolio. She spread 3 sheets on the table. She spent 4 months inside our family before Marcus caught her going through the documents. What saved him was a specific detail. She asked him once about the account structure and used a term that his financial advisor had told him specifically was outdated industry terminology. Nobody still active in finance uses it. Marcus flagged it, came home early, found her with the files. I leaned forward and looked at the sheets, timeline financial targets, methodical approach. The same structure Matthew had found on Tarara's laptop, just aimed at different numbers. How did she leave? I asked. Gone in 90 minutes, Eleanor said. She had a bag packed somewhere we never found. Her apartment was rented under a third name month-to-month, already paid through the end of the month, so nobody would notice her absence immediately. She looked up at me. She is very good at disappearing, Mr. Sullivan, which means she is very good at knowing when to leave. She's still here, I said. I know. Eleanor's jaw tightened visibly, and that is the part I cannot figure out. In every previous instance, she ran before the legal exposure became this serious. She paused, unless something is different this time. Twist 10 landed quietly in the space between us. I had been thinking about it since Hector mentioned that Julian had been confused about why Victoria stayed longer than necessary in Portland. I had been thinking about it since Richard noticed Victoria pausing at the kitchen window the night she helped clean up after dinner, asking about Margaret with an expression that did not perform the way her other expressions performed. Maybe something different, I said. Eleanor looked at me steadily. Tell me. I told her what Hector had found. That Victoria had missed 3 exit windows that Julian had apparently built into the operation. That she had stayed past the point where the plan required her presence. That Julian, by Hector's read of the communication structure, had pushed back on the delays. Eleanor absorbed this without comment. Then she reached into the accordion folder and produced a photograph. A small girl, dark-haired, maybe 4 years old, sitting on a porch step with a stuffed bear pressed to her chest. My breath stopped. Her name is Maya, Eleanor said quietly. Victoria's daughter, 4 years old, living with Victoria's aunt in Billings, Montana. Victoria sends money every month has since Maya was born. She laid the photograph flat on the table. I found her 6 months ago, while tracking Victoria's financial movements. The money Victoria sends is not from the shell company funds. It comes from a separate personal account that Julian apparently doesn't know about. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The small girl on the porch step, the stuffed bear, the expression on her face that was simply the expression of a child who did not know she was being photographed, who was just sitting in the sun, with her bear existing completely in the ordinary peace of a morning. That had nothing to do with any of this. Something moved through me that was not anger and was not sympathy exactly. It was heavier than both, and it sat in my chest and would not shift. "She's hiding money from Julian," I said. "It looks that way," Eleanor said. "Small amounts consistent, like someone who is building something secret." She looked at me. "I don't know what that means for your situation, but I thought you needed to know." I picked up the photograph, carefully looked at it once more, then set it back down on the table. "When it means," I said slowly, "that Victoria Lawson is not entirely Julian Vance's instrument, and that Julian Vance knows it." I pressed my fingers flat on the table, which means there's a crack in this thing, and cracks are what you build a case through. Eleanor studied me for a moment. "You were a detective for 30 years. Homicide," I said. She nodded once like something had confirmed itself. "Then you know what I'm going to say next. We need to be faster than they are," I said. "We have 5 days. Eleanor said she has a flight booked. I found it this morning. Portland to Miami Friday, 2 tickets." I looked at the photograph of Maya on the porch step one more time. A 4-year-old girl in Billings, Montana, whose mother sent money every month from an account her partner didn't know existed. 5 days, I said. Then I reached for my phone and called Hector Vargas. The sycamore tree in my front yard had lost half its leaves overnight. I noticed it when Matthew's truck pulled into the driveway Monday morning. The leaves scattered across the gravel in wet clumps, the branches above them suddenly bared and angular against the gray October sky, the whole tree looking like something that had been holding on for a long time and had finally quietly let go. Matthew came through the front door without knocking the way he had his whole life, and I heard the particular sound of his boots on the hardwood, heavier than usual, the walk of a man carrying more than his body weight. He looked like he had not slept either. He dropped into the kitchen chair across from mine and put both elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face hard, like he was trying to push something back in. His shoulders were rigid, his breath came in slow and deliberate, the controlled breathing of someone managing themselves very carefully. "She asked me about the account this morning," he said, his voice muffled behind his hands. "The joint account? She said she wanted to transfer some money for furniture. Said she'd found a place in the Pearl District that was having a sale." He dropped his hands and looked at me, and his eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, from the particular exhaustion of a man who has been pretending for weeks. I told her the bank was doing a system update and it might be a day or two. She said, "Okay." She smiled at me. Dad just smiled and said, "Okay," and asked if I wanted eggs. My jaw tightened until I could feel the pressure running all the way up into my temples. "How did you leave it with her?" I asked. I told her I had a job site to check in Hood River. She kissed me goodbye. He said the last 3 words the way you say something that has turned into a different thing than it used to be, carefully, like the words themselves might cut him. She kissed me goodbye and told me to drive safe. I reached across the table and pushed the coffee mug toward him. He took it without looking at it and wrapped both hands around it and stared at the table surface. I told him everything. Cynthia's phone call, Rebecca Tanner and the stolen estate files, Eleanor Croft in Denver, Maya in Billings, the Friday flight, every piece of it laid out in the order it had come to me, the way I used to brief a partner before an operation. Matthew listened without interrupting. His hands tightened around the mug as I talked. I watched his knuckles go from pink to white and back again as each piece landed. When I got to Maya, something moved across his face that was too complicated to name in a single word. Grief and confusion, and something that was almost pity cracking through the anger like a fissure in concrete. "She has a daughter," he said, 4 years old. I said she's been sending money every month from an account Julian doesn't know about. Matthew set the mug down. He pressed the back of one hand against his mouth. His chest rose and fell once very slowly, and I recognized the motion. It was the same thing he had done as a boy, when he was trying not to cry in front of me, this enormous deliberate inhale that he used like a wall. Part of me still doesn't want it to be true, he said. His voice was barely above a breath. I know what I saw on that laptop. I know what you found. And part of me is still sitting here thinking, what if there's an explanation? What if we're wrong? I looked at my son across the kitchen table. This man who had stood at an altar 4 days ago and smiled through every vow, who had kissed a woman goodbye this morning and driven 40 minutes to his father's house, carrying something no one his age should have to carry. And I felt something move through me that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the years behind us. I had not been there enough. I had given him a mother who compensated for my absence with everything she had. And then I had let him lose her. And then I had stood at the edge of his life and called it respect for his independence when it was really just the continuation of a habit I had never bothered to break. Matthew. My voice came out lower than I intended. I need to say something that has nothing to do with Victoria. He looked up since I wasn't there enough when you were growing up. I said, your mother covered for me more times than you know. Every game I missed, every dinner I came home late to. She made excuses for me and I let her make them, and that was wrong. I kept my eyes on his. I should have been the kind of father a son calls first when everything falls apart. I wasn't. I know that. My throat tightened around the last part. I'm here now. Whatever this takes, however long it takes, I'm not going anywhere. Matthew's face did something then that I had not seen it do since the hospital the morning after Margaret died. The control cracked. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just a small fracture running from his jaw to his eyes. A moment where all the weeks of performance and exhaustion and grief pressed through the wall he had built. He cleared his throat hard, looked at the window. I know, Dad, he said, rough-voiced. I know you are. We sat there for a moment with the Monday morning coming gray through the kitchen windows and the sycamore leaves wet on the driveway outside. And then Matthew straightened in his chair and something settled in his expression. Not hardness, but resolution, the specific quality of a person who has decided to keep going. What do you need me to do? He asked. Keep acting normal, I said. Go home, be your husband for 4 more days. Can you do that? He looked at me steadily. I've done it for 3 weeks already. I know, I said. I know you have. He stood up and pulled his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door, he stopped and turned back his hand frame. Dad, she asked me last week what Mom was like. His voice was careful. She sat across from me at dinner and asked what Mom laughed at, what she was afraid of, what she wanted that she never got. A pause. I told her. I told her everything. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at me. I don't know what to do with that. I did not have an answer for him. I just looked at my son and felt the full weight of what he was carrying, and I let him see that I felt it. I go home, I said quietly. I'll call you tonight. He nodded. Then he was gone, the front door closing behind him, and I stood in the kitchen alone and listened to his truck back out of the driveway and pull away down the road, and the sound of the engine fading into the gray morning was the loneliest sound I had heard in 4 years. I went back to the table. I picked up my phone. Hector had texted while Matthew and I were talking one line. Julian Vance checked into a Portland hotel last night, 12 minutes from Matthew's apartment. I stared at the message. My thumb hovered over Hector's name. Then I started to plan. Hector was already at the coffee shop on 3rd Avenue. When I arrived at 2 Clay Monday afternoon, same corner table he always chose, back to the wall, clear sight lines to both the entrance and the street. A habit so deeply ingrained after 30 years of police work that I doubted he even made the choice consciously anymore. He had 2 coffees waiting. He pushed one toward me when I sat down, and I picked it up without thanking him, because after 35 years we had stopped thanking each other for the small things. 12 minutes, I said. 12 minutes, he confirmed. He had a notepad on the table, covered in his particular. Shorthand, a system of abbreviations he had developed sometime in the 90s that no one else on the force had ever been able to decode. He checked in under a business name, a consulting firm registered in Washington state. I traced the registration. It connects to the same LLC structure we've been following. He turned the notepad toward me. He paid for 3 nights. Checks out Thursday, one day before Tarara's flight. I picked up the coffee and drank half of it without tasting it. He's here to supervise the final stage. That's how it reads. Hector pulled the notepad back and tapped it with his pen, which means the timeline is accelerating. Rich, they're not waiting 30 days. They were never waiting 30 days. That was a worst-case buffer. The real plan is faster. He looked at me steadily. How fast can Cynthia move? I called her this morning. I said she's working on a protective filing for Matthew's accounts, the joint account specifically. If Victoria tries to access it before we're ready to move the bank flags, it holds the transaction for review. I set the coffee down. It buys us time. Not much, but some. What about Matthew? He's holding together barely. I said it plainly because Hector was not someone I softened things for. He went home this morning. He's going to maintain until Thursday. Hector absorbed this and said nothing for a moment, which meant he was thinking something he was deciding whether to say. I waited. The joint account, he said finally. Matthew opened it after the engagement. Whose idea was it? I looked at him. What do you mean? Whose idea was it to open a joint account before the wedding? His voice was careful. Daniel's or Tarara's? The question landed in my chest like a cold hand pressing flat. I thought back. Matthew had mentioned it in passing 2 months before the wedding. They were combining finances, starting the practical side of things early. It made sense logistically. He had said it the way people say things that feel uncomplicated, things that have been made to feel uncomplicated. I don't know, I said. Hector turned his coffee mug in a slow circle. Because $180, zeros in sitting in a joint account that both parties have equal legal access to, is not a standard pre-wedding financial move. Most couples wait until after the ceremony. It's the most accessible asset in the entire Sullivan picture. More liquid than property, more immediate than retirement accounts. My stomach turned over slowly. She suggested it. Now almost certainly, Hector said, and Matthew being Matthew, thought it was a sign she was committed to building something real with him. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth. The fury that moved through me was the cold, deep kind again. Not at Matthew, not at myself, at the particular deliberateness of what Victoria and Julian had constructed. The joint account had not been a convenience. It had been a mechanism suggested and accepted and opened with Matthew's full and trusting cooperation because that was how this worked. You made the target feel like the decisions were their own. In Cynthia's protective filing, I said ow to process. She said 48 hours, Hector said, which means Wednesday morning the account is flagged. If Victoria tries to access it after that, the bank holds the transaction and contacts Matthew. And Julian checks out Thursday, I said, which means they plan to move Wednesday or Thursday. Hector nodded. Then we need to be ready Wednesday, I said. That's 36 hours, Rich. I know what 36 hours is, Hector. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his pen. Eleanor Croft arrived at the coffee shop at 2:45. She came in from the street with her messenger bag and her accordion folder, and the particular forward lean of someone whose default speed is faster than everyone around her. She shook Hector's hand, sat down, and opened her folder on the table without preamble. Should I found the connection between the Denver operation and Hale, she said. It took me all night, but it's there. She laid a single sheet on the table, a chain of company registrations, names, and dates in tight columns. 18 months before Denver, a Delaware LLC, made a seed payment to a Nevada holding company. That Nevada company funded the logistics of the Denver operation. The fake consulting firm Victoria used as cover the apartment under the false name, the forged professional references. She tapped the top of the chain. The Delaware LLC is Cynthia Thorne. Hector leaned forward. Same structure as the Portland payments. Same structure, same pattern, same intervals, Eleanor said. He's been running this playbook for at least 4 years. Denver was not the first. It may not even be the third. She looked at me. Silas Thorne has been systematically funding targeted financial fraud operations across multiple states. Your son is the largest target I found, but he is not the first, and if we don't stop this here, he will not be the last. I looked at the chain of registrations on the table. 4 years of careful, patient construction. An operation built on hatred for one man, me, that had expanded into something larger, something that had swallowed up other families, other sons and daughters as Hale refined and grew the machine. My hands were flat on the table and I looked at them for a moment. The hands that had arrested Silas Thorne 8 years ago, that had done the right thing by every standard I had ever held myself to, and had somehow set in motion a chain of events that led to this coffee shop table to my son in his apartment 12 minutes, from a man who had come to supervise the theft of his life. We freeze the accounts, I said. Wednesday morning. We coordinate with Cynthia to ensure the protective filing goes through first thing. Then we give Victoria and Julian nothing to work with, and we wait for them to move. And when they move, Eleanor asked, they'll try to contact each other. Hector said, when the accounts are frozen and the timeline collapses, Julian will reach out to Victoria if we can document that communication device. We have the wire, I said. We have the payment chain. We have false credentials placed inside Cynthia's firm. We have a pattern across multiple states. I looked at Eleanor. You said you've been building this file for 2 years. Everything I have, she said, is yours. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while we talked, and I drank it anyway because it was something to do with my hands while I ran through the arithmetic of 36 hours and what had to happen inside them. Matthew was in his apartment right now, 12 minutes from Julian Vance's hotel, sitting across from a woman who had kissed him goodbye this morning and asked what his mother used to laugh at, and who had a 4-year-old daughter in Montana that she sent money to from a secret account, and who had stayed past every exit window Julian had built for her. I did not know what any of that meant. I only knew that it did not change what needed to happen. I set the cup down and looked at Hector and Eleanor. Wednesday morning, I said, we move. Tyler Brooks was already at the table when I walked into the diner on Tuesday morning. A corner booth at a place called Harlow's on Burnside. The kind of establishment that had been serving the same eggs and the same coffee to the same neighborhood for 40 years, and had no interest in changing either. He had ordered coffee for both of us. He was turning his mug in slow circles on the laminate tabletop. And when he saw me come through the door, he stopped turning it and sat up straighter and looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite getting there. I slid into the booth across from him and picked up my coffee. Thanks for coming, I said. Of course. His voice was careful. Tyler Brooks, at 29, was the kind of young man who tried to read a room before he committed to a tone, which was one of the reasons Matthew had stayed friends with him since college. He was attentive in the way that thoughtful people are attentive, genuinely curious about other people, rather than performing curiosity at them. Is Matthew okay? He's managing, I said. Tyler, I need to ask you some questions. Some of them might be uncomfortable. He nodded both hands around his mug, waiting. The networking event in Seattle, I said. The one where you met Victoria. Walk me through it again, but slower this time. Everything you remember. Tyler took a breath. LinkedIn email like I told you at the wedding. The organization was called. He frowned. Pacific Northwest Professional Development Coalition, or something close to that long name. Looked legitimate on the email header. The venue was a hotel on 2nd Avenue in Belltown. I almost didn't go. It was a Wednesday, but the speaker lineup looked good. 3 names I actually recognized from the finance world. Did you know anyone else there? I asked. A few faces. Nobody I was close with. He turned his mug again slowly. Victoria walked up to me about 40 minutes in near the drinks table. A pause. She knew my name, Mr. Sullivan. I remember because I thought, have we met before? But she said she recognized me from LinkedIn and had wanted to connect. His jaw tightened fractionally. I thought that was flattering. He stopped. Now you're thinking it differently, I said. Yeah. The word came out rough. He pressed his lips together and looked at the table. She spent an hour talking to me. Asked about my work, asked about Portland, asked about the people I knew there. He exhaled. She asked about Matthew by name. She said she'd seen him on my LinkedIn connections and asked if we were close. His hand tightened around the mug. I told her he was my best friend. I told her he was a good guy who'd been through a hard time losing his mom and that he deserved something good. His voice cracked on the last word. Just the edge of it, just enough to hear. I gift-wrapped him for her, Mr. Sullivan. I handed her exactly what she needed to know, and I thought I was just making conversation. I looked at Tyler across the booth. This young man, whose fundamental decency had been identified and weaponized by people who had mapped his LinkedIn profile and built an event around getting him into a room with a woman who would make the most of 40 minutes. "Tyler," I said, "look at me." He looked up. "And you were targeted specifically because of who you are." I said, "Because you are loyal. Because you are the kind of person who talks about his friends. The way you just talked about Matthew. They chose you because they knew you would do exactly what a good friend does." I held his gaze. "That is not a failure. That is who you are, and they used it, which makes what they did worse, not something you are responsible for." Something cracked in Tyler's face, a fast, involuntary crumpling around the eyes that he controlled quickly, pressing his mouth flat and blinking twice. His hands on the mug were white-knuckled. "I keep thinking," he said, "about all the times I talked about Matthew to her. All the things I told her about his mom, about the Hood River house, about how much he wanted to find someone real." His voice had gone rough and low. "Every single thing I said, she was filing it. She was using it." "Yes," I said, "because Tyler deserved the truth more than he deserved comfort right now. She was, and knowing that is hard. It should be hard." I leaned forward slightly. "And now I'm asking you to use that knowledge to help him." Tyler looked up sharply. "What do you need?" I told him enough. Not everything, but enough. The operation, the timeline, the Friday flight, that we were moving Wednesday, and that when it was over, Matthew was going to need the people around him to still be standing. Tyler listened without interrupting. His expression changed as I talked, the guilt and the grief compacting into something harder, something that looked less like self-rumination and more like purpose. When I finished, he sat for a moment. "Be there for him when it's done," he said. It was not a question. "Be there for him when it's done," I confirmed. He nodded, jaw set. "I can do that." I started to slide out of the booth and Tyler spoke again. "Mr. Sullivan." I stopped. He was looking at his coffee mug, not at me, and his voice had dropped to something quieter. "Matthew told me once after your wife died that the thing he missed most wasn't the big stuff. It wasn't holidays or birthdays. It was just her being in the house, the sound of her moving around in the kitchen in the morning." He looked up. He said it was the quietest the house had ever been. My throat tightened until swallowing required effort. "Yeah," I said, "it was." Tyler nodded once. His eyes were bright at the corners. I left him at the table with his coffee and walked out of Harlos into the Tuesday morning, and the cold air off the river hit me clean and sharp. And I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my hands in my jacket pockets, feeling the weight of what Matthew's best friend had just told me settle into my chest alongside everything else I was carrying. The sound of her moving around in the kitchen in the morning. I had heard that sound every day for 34 years. And then one morning it had simply stopped, and it had been the loudest silence I had ever lived in, and I had spent 4 years learning to inhabit it without breaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Hector's number," I answered. "Rich," he said. "Eleanor found something in the Montana records about Maya." A pause. "You need to hear this before Wednesday." I started walking toward my car. "Tell me," I said. I drove back from Harlo's with Hector's words running on a loop in my head. Records about Maya. The Hood River Highway was empty at midday. The kind of empty that only happens on weekdays in October when the summer tourists are gone and the apple harvest crews have moved on, and the valley settles back into itself like a man exhaling after holding his breath too long. I drove the speed limit. I always drive the speed limit when my mind is somewhere else. Hector was waiting in my driveway when I pulled in. He was leaning against the hood of his truck with his arms crossed and his jacket collar turned up against the wind. And when I got out of the car, he looked at me with an expression I recognized from 30 years of working difficult cases together. The look that said, "What I am about to tell you is going to change how you see this." "Inside," I said. We sat at the kitchen table. Hector put a single printed page between us. "Eleanor pulled Maya's birth records from Yellowstone County, Montana," he said. "Standard public filing, father listed as unknown." He tapped the page, but Eleanor dug further. "Victoria applied for a protective order in Billings 18 months ago. The application was filed and then withdrawn 4 days later." I looked at the page against whom Julian Vance Hector said. The kitchen was very quiet around us. Outside, the wind moved through the apple trees and the branches knocked softly against each other, a sound I had heard 10,000 times from this table and had never once consciously registered until the silence around it made it loud. She tried to get a restraining order against her own brother, I said. My half-brother, Hector said, and she pulled it 4 days later, which means either he talked her out of it or someone applied pressure or she decided she was too far in to pull back. He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle. Eleanor thinks Julian found out about the Montana account, the one he wasn't supposed to know about, the one Victoria has been using to send money to Maya every month. I sat back in my chair and pressed one hand flat against the table and looked at it. A father's hand, 65 years old, the knuckles a little larger than they used to be, a faint scar along the index finger from a fence wire I had caught badly 20 years ago, fixing the back perimeter of this property. Margaret had cleaned that cut at this same table, scolded me for not wearing gloves, put a bandage on it with more care than the wound required. I thought about us sitting on a porch step with a stuffed bear who did not know her mother, had tried to put legal distance between herself and the man who was running her life. Julian controls her. I said, that's how Eleanor reads it. Hector said, the operation started as a partnership. Julian built the architecture, Victoria was the face, but somewhere along the way the balance shifted. Julian found out about Maya, found out Victoria was hiding money, and that became leverage. Something moved through my chest. That was not anger, and was not grief, and was not sympathy. It was all three of them at once compressed into something heavy and shapeless that pressed outward against my ribs from the inside. I thought about what Matthew had said at the kitchen table this morning. Part of me still doesn't want it to be, and I had understood it then as the response of a man who had loved someone and was struggling to let the love go, even when the evidence made it impossible to hold. But I was thinking about it differently now. Victoria Lawson had stayed past every exit window Julian had built for her. She had opened a secret account for Maya that Julian did not know about. She had tried once to get a legal order, putting distance between herself and the man who held the blueprint of her entire criminal life. And then she had withdrawn the application and gone back because she was too far in, because Julian had Maya's location. Because the only thing protecting a 4-year-old girl in Montana from whatever Julian Vance was capable of was Tarara's continued cooperation. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The apple trees, the fence line, the pale Tuesday sky pressing down on Hood River. Shh. She's not just running a con on Matthew, I said to the window, to the apple trees, to whatever part of Margaret was still present in this kitchen. She's trapped. Doesn't change what she's doing to your son, Hector said from the table behind me. No, I said, it doesn't. I turned back around. My jaw was set and my chest was tight, and every feeling I was carrying about Tarara Lawson had just become more complicated than I had the time or the luxury to fully process, because Wednesday was tomorrow, and tomorrow was what mattered. Does Matthew know? Hector asked. Not yet, I said. I'll tell him tonight. Hector nodded. He gathered the page from the table and folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he looked at me with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had stood next to me in hard places for 3.5 decades. This changes the approach, he said. If Julian has leverage over Victoria, and Victoria knows the operation is collapsing, she may not run. She may go to Julian first, which is what we need, I said. We need them in contact when Cynthia's filing goes through. We need the communication documented. Hector stood up. I'll coordinate with Eleanor tonight. We'll have everything in position by morning. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and paused. Richard, what she did to Matthew is real. What Julian did to her is also real. Both things are true. I know, I said. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and went to the back door, and I listened to his truck start in the driveway and pull away down the road. And I stood alone in the kitchen, with the apple trees outside the window, and the printed birth record still vivid in my memory, and the weight of what tomorrow required pressing down on everything else. I picked up my phone and called Matthew. He answered on the second ring. His voice was careful, controlled, the performance still in place. Hey, Dad, he said with the casual ease of a man who might just be checking in. Hey, I said, I need to tell you something tonight. Can you come by after dinner? A pause brief. Yeah, he said. "I'll be there." I set the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the apple trees still outside the window, the afternoon light going flat and gray across the fence line. Both things could be true at the same time. What Julian had done to Victoria was real. What Victoria had done to Matthew was real. I had spent 30 years working cases where the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred in ways that kept me awake at night, and I had never found a clean answer, and I was not going to find one now. Tomorrow was what mattered. Tomorrow was the only thing left. Matthew arrived at 8:15. He came in through the back door the way he always did, and I heard him stop in the mudroom longer than usual. The sound of him pulling off his jacket, hanging it on the hook, the small, deliberate pause of a man preparing himself for whatever came next. He walked into the kitchen and looked at my face and said, "How bad is it?" "Sit down," I said. He sat. I poured 2 glasses of water because my hands needed something to do, and coffee at 8 in the evening was not something either of us needed. And I set one in front of him and kept one for myself and stood at the counter and told him about Maya and the protective order and what Hector and Eleanor believed it meant about Julian's hold over Victoria. Matthew listened, the way he had been listening to hard information all week, with his elbows on the table and his hands loosely folded, and his eyes steady and his jaw doing the small periodic work of staying controlled. But when I got to the protective order, when I said Victoria had tried once to get a legal barrier between herself and Julian, and then pulled the application 4 days later, something shifted in Matthew's face. It was not softening exactly. It was more like a fracture, a fine line running through the hardness he had been building all week, letting through something complicated and unwelcome. "She was scared of him," Matthew said. "That's how Eleanor reads it. I said she was scared of him, and she stayed anyway." He pressed his knuckles against his mouth, his eyes went bright at the corners, and his jaw tightened until the muscle flexed visibly. "Because of Maya. That's what the evidence suggests," I said. Matthew pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the kitchen window, the same window I had stood at a dozen times this week, and put one hand on the frame and looked out at the dark backyard. The apple trees invisible beyond the glass, just the reflection of the kitchen light on the black surface of the night. "I asked her once," he said, his voice rough at the edges, "if she had ever been in a situation she couldn't get out of. We were talking about something else, some news story I don't even remember, and she went quiet in this specific way." He turned from the window, and his eyes were wet at the rims, and he did not try to hide it. Not her usual quiet, something different. And then she said, "Sometimes the only way out is through." And she changed the subject. He pressed the back of his hand hard across his eyes. I thought she was talking about something old, something that was over, required concentration. "Matthew," I said, "I know." His voice cracked down the middle on the second word, and he pressed his lips together hard and breathed through his nose. "I know it doesn't change what she did. I know that she made choices, and those choices were—" He stopped. Started again. I'm not excusing it. Just another stop. His hand came up and gripped the back of a kitchen chair until his knuckles went white. "I keep seeing her face, Dad, when she was actually laughing at something, not performing, when something actually surprised her and she laughed before she could arrange it." His voice dropped to almost nothing. I don't know how much of it was real. I crossed the kitchen and stood beside my son. I did not have an answer for what he had just asked, because the honest answer was that I did not know either, and I was not going to offer him a clean resolution that the evidence did not support. What I knew was that Victoria Lawson had a 4-year-old daughter in Montana and a secret account and a withdrawn protective order and a half-brother who had turned her pain into a machine, and that none of that made what she had done to Matthew acceptable, and that both of those things were true at the same time, and that Matthew was going to have to live with that ambiguity in a way that I could not resolve for him no matter how much I wanted to. I put my hand on his shoulder. He dropped his head and pressed his fist against his mouth, and his shoulders shook once, just once, hard and involuntary. And then he pulled in a long, deliberate breath and straightened. "Tomorrow," he said. His voice was steadier, deliberate. "Tomorrow," I confirmed. "Cynthia's filing goes through at 9 in the morning. The moment the account is flagged, Victoria will know something is wrong. She'll contact Julian." "And that's what you need," Matthew said. That's what we need, I said. He turned to look at me. His eyes were still bright, but his expression had settled into something. I recognized the same resolution I had seen on his face this morning when he asked what I needed him to do, the look of a person who has processed something painful and decided to keep moving anyway. One more night, he said. One more night, I said. Then it's done. Matthew picked up his jacket from the mudroom hook and shrugged it on, and at the back door he stopped and looked back at me with his hand on the frame. Dad, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes out about her, he held my gaze. You did the right thing starting from the beginning. You didn't stop reading people just because you retired. My chest filled with something warm and aching that had no clean name. Your mother told me not to, I said. Matthew nodded, his mouth curved. Not a full smile, but something true. I know, he said. She told me the same thing about you. Then he was out the door, and I stood in the mudroom, listening to his truck start and the headlights sweep across the kitchen window as he backed out, and I stayed there until the sound of his engine disappeared down the road. Then I went to the office and looked at Margaret's photograph for a long time. Tomorrow, I said to her. It ends tomorrow. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of October morning in Hood River that feels like the world has been rinsed overnight sky. A deep uniform blue apple trees, perfectly still air off the river, sharp enough to ache when you stepped outside. I had been up since 4:30. By 6. I had been through every document, twice organized Hector's printouts into the clearest possible sequence, and drunk 3 cups of coffee I had no memory of making. The legal pad was full. The case against Tarara Lawson, Julian Vance, and Silas Thorne was as complete as I could make it from a kitchen table in Hood River, and now it needed to move into hands that could do more with it than I could. Hector arrived at 6:45. Eleanor 5 minutes later through the back door together, the kind of coordination that happens when people who are not professionally partnered start thinking like a team. Eleanor spread the accordion folder on the table. Hector put his notepad beside it. I poured coffee for all 3 of us. Cynthia's filing goes through at 9, I said. The moment it does, the joint account is flagged. Any transaction Victoria initiates gets held pending Matthew's confirmation. She'll try before 9, Eleanor said certain. She knows Julian checks out tomorrow. She'll want to move money before the exit window closes. She looked at me between 7 and 8 this morning, and when the transaction fails, Hector said she contacts Julian. I called Matthew at 6:50. He answered immediately awake far longer than I had been, the flatness in his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a night spent lying still without sleeping. She's already been on her phone, he said quietly, speaking carefully from a room where someone else was sleeping. She got up at 5:30, was in the kitchen for 40 minutes. My jaw tightened. Stay in the apartment. If she asks about the account, tell her you have a call with the bank this morning to sort out the system issue. Okay, very steady. The steadiness of someone who has used up all the unsteady and come out the other side. Matthew. I kept my voice low. This is the last morning. A pause. I know, Dad. At 8:12, Eleanor's phone buzzed. Her expression shifted, the forward-leaning focus of someone receiving confirmation of exactly what they predicted. Cynthia's bank contact flagged an attempted transaction, she said. Joint account $15,000 initiated at 8:09. She looked up, declined pending review. Hector and I looked at each other across the table. At 8:27, Hector read from his screen. Julian's phone made a call at 8:23. 4 minutes, receiving number registered to a prepaid carrier. Tara's secondary phone. 4 minutes, Eleanor said. Long enough to tell him the account is blocked. Long enough for him to tell her what to do next. I stood up. My hands were not shaking. They had not shaken once this week. The particular calm that comes is not from absence of fear, but from having moved through it so completely that what remains on the other side is simply clarity. He'll tell her to come to the hotel. I said he can't manage a collapsed timeline over the phone. I called Cynthia Montgomery. She answered before I spoke. The filing went through, and I just received notification of the decline transaction. Richard, they moved faster than we expected. Cynthia, call your contact at the Oregon Department of Justice, the Fraud Division. Give them everything. The full file payment chains the false employee. Tell them we have documented communication between 2 parties coordinating financial fraud, and we need someone at the Marriott on Southwest Broadway by 10. A brief pause. That's 40 minutes, Richard. And I need you to know I have been building this relationship with the fraud division for 3 years. They know me. They know how I work. If I tell them we have a documented multi-state wire fraud operation with a flight booked for tomorrow, they will move. Then move them, I said. I'll make the call, she said. At 9:15, Hector's phone buzzed. He read the message, and for the first time all morning, the set of his shoulders dropped, releasing something he had been holding since he arrived. Victoria left the apartment building at 9:08. He set on foot toward the Burnside transit stop. He looked at me. She took a rolling suitcase. Eleanor made a sharp sound under her breath. She's not going to the hotel to strategize, I said. She's running. Hector was already dialing. I called Matthew. He answered before the first ring finished. She's gone, he said, raw and quiet and utterly controlled. She left 20 minutes ago. Said she had an errand. She kissed me on the cheek. A breath. She took the green bag she keeps under the bed. The one she said had winter clothes in it. Stay in the apartment, I said. Lock the door. Don't go anywhere until I call you back. Is it over? He asked. I looked at Hector coordinating with Roar at Eleanor on her phone at the kitchen table, covered in 6 days of accumulated evidence. Cynthia's filings, Hector's printouts, Eleanor's accordion folder, the photograph page of Margaret's journal in its clear sleeve in the corner. Almost, I said. Almost. At 9:41, Hector ended a call and looked at me. Roar's team picked up Julian Vance at the Marriott lobby at 9:38, he said. Tarara Lawson was detained at the Burnside transit stop at 9:32. She did not resist. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor set her phone down slowly, the way you set down something you have been gripping for a very long time. Her jaw was tight. She breathed through her nose once hard. Denver, she said quietly. Not a question, not a statement. Just the name of the place where everything had started for her, said aloud into a Hood River kitchen, because it was finally actually over. I looked at Hector. He looked at me. Silas Thorne, I said. Roar says the DOJ has the payment chain. Hector said warrant by end of day. He paused. He is not going to see this coming, Rich. He thought he had 9 more days. I looked at Margaret's photograph through the open office doorway. The apple orchard, the loose hair, the laugh that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with why it mattered. I picked up my phone and called my son. Matthew answered on the first ring. They have Julian, I said. They have Victoria. It's done. A silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone whose body needed 3 seconds to process the release of something held at maximum tension for 3 weeks and 6 days. Then Matthew made a sound that was not a word. Low and rough and completely unguarded. The sound a man makes when he has been strong for so long that the moment's strength is no longer required, everything underneath comes through at once. Okay, he said finally. His voice was wrecked. Okay, go somewhere you feel safe, I said. Call Tyler. I'll be in Portland within. I ended the call and looked at Hector and Eleanor across the kitchen table. Silas Thorne, I said. Hector was already on his phone. Roar says the DOJ Fraud Division executed the warrant at 10:17. Thorne was at his Pearl District condo. He listened another moment. He wants to talk, Rich, specifically to you. His attorney is allowing it one conversation, no recording before they process him. Eleanor looked at me sharply. You don't have to do that. I know, I said. I drove to Portland alone. The DOJ field office on Southwest 3rd Avenue looked exactly as it always had. Gray concrete fluorescent entry. The institutional smell of carpet cleaner and recycled air that every government building in every American city shares, as if by design requirement. A woman at the front desk checked my identification and asked me to wait, and I stood in the lobby with my jacket on and my hands in my pockets, feeling the particular stillness of a man who has finished a long piece of work and has not yet figured out how to inhabit the quiet it leaves behind. They brought me to a conference room on the 2nd floor. Small table, 4 chairs, a window facing the parking structure next door. Silas Thorne was already seated, his attorney beside him. A man in his 50s with an expensive suit and the careful expression of someone managing the implementation of advice already given. Thorne looked older. 8 years in a medium security facility in Salem had done what 8 years does to a man in his 60s, grayer, softer around the jaw, features flattened by institutional routine. But his eyes were the same, dark, very still, the eyes of a man who had spent a long time waiting. "Sullivan," he said. "Thorne," I said. I sat across from him. Nobody else spoke. "You wanted to talk," I said. Thorne folded his hands on the table, knuckles, large fingers, stiff the way joints get after a certain age. "I want you to understand something," he said. His voice was quieter than I remembered. "Not as an excuse, as a fact. Go ahead. When your investigation collapsed, my company, I lost the Morrison Street building, the East Side development, the Pearl District project that took 11 years to assemble." He looked at his hands. "My wife lost the house she lived in for 22 years. My son lost his college fund. My daughter was 16 and had to change schools." He looked up. "I am not saying the investigation was wrong. I know what I did. I am telling you what it caused. I felt something that was not sympathy and not vindication, something quieter. The recognition that the damage a man does when he enforces the law does not disappear simply because the law is. I know what it cost," I said. "I followed up on every case I ever made. I knew what happened to your family." Something shifted in his face. "Then why? Because knowing the cost does not make it wrong to enforce the law," I said. "And what you chose to do with that cost is on you, Silas, not me." I held his gaze. "You paid two people to aim your pain at my son, at a 31-year-old man who had nothing to do with what I did 8 years ago, who lost his mother 4 years ago and was trying to build something good." My voice stayed level. "That is not what a man does when he has been wronged. That is what a man does when he has decided everyone else's pain matters less than his own." Thorne's jaw tightened. His eyes went bright at the edges, not with tears, with something harder. "You kept your family," he said, very low. "I wanted you to know what it felt like not to." "I know exactly what it feels like," I said. "My wife died 4 years ago. I know what it means to sit in a house that is too quiet, to watch your son carry grief you cannot lift for him." I looked at him without blinking, and I did not pay anyone $120,000 to destroy a stranger's life because of it. The room was very quiet. Thorne looked at me a long moment. His attorney put a hand briefly on his arm. Then Thorne looked down at his folded hands and said nothing more. I stood, picked up my jacket, and stopped at the door without turning around. "Your family lost things they should not have lost. I said that is real, and I am not dismissing it. But Matthew is my son, and you do not get to use my son to settle a score with me." I walked out. The city moved around me on the October sidewalk, indifferent, continuous, completely unaware that anything had just ended. I stood there and breathed. Then I called Matthew. "I'm on my way," I said. "Put the coffee on." The cemetery outside Hood River sat on a gentle rise east of town, sheltered on 3 sides by Douglas firs that had been there longer than the town itself. Margaret had chosen the plot herself 2 years before she got sick on a Sunday afternoon drive when she announced without preamble that she wanted to see the view from up there before she needed it. I had told her that was morbid. She had told me that was practical. She had been right, as she was about most things. Matthew and I arrived Friday morning, 2 days after the arrests, 3 weeks and 9 days after a wedding that had not been what it appeared to be. The October morning was cold, and still the fir trees, dark against a sky, the pale blue of late autumn, the grass between the headstones silvered with frost that had not yet melted in the thin morning sun. We walked without hurrying. Matthew had his hands in his jacket pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. I walked beside him, the way I had walked beside him at Margaret's funeral 4 years ago. Close enough that our arms occasionally touched, far enough that he had his own space inside whatever he was carrying. We stopped in front of Margaret's headstone. It was simple, her name, the years, and a line she had chosen from a poem she kept on the refrigerator for 30 years. The line said, "I was here and I loved well." She had said the rest was nobody's business but ours. Matthew stood looking at the stone. His jaw was working. His eyes were very bright in the cold air. Then he said, "I never blamed you, Dad." I looked at him for not making it to the hospital in time. His voice was rough and careful. Each word placed deliberately, the way you place words, carried a long time before finally setting them down. "I know you've been carrying that for 4." He turned to look at me, eyes wet, but expression steady. "I was angry that night. I was angry at everything, but I was never angry at you." My throat closed completely. In 30 years of learning to expect the unexpected, I had not seen this coming. It hit me full and direct with nowhere to deflect it. My eyes burned. I looked at Margaret's headstone and felt 4 years of something I had been calling guilt shift and reshape into something I could not immediately name. Not absolution exactly. More like the releasing of a breath I had not known I was holding. I should have been there, I said barely above a whisper. You're here now, Matthew said. He said it simply, no drama, no weight of a forgiveness speech. Just a fact, said the way you say something that is true, and that is enough. I reached out and put my hand on the back of his neck the way I had when he was small, a gesture I had not made in years. The particular hand on the back of the neck that means I've got you in the language. Fathers and sons speak when words are not large enough. Matthew's shoulders shook once hard. Then he pulled in a long breath and straightened, and when he lifted his face, his eyes were red-rimmed and clear. She left you a message, I said. Matthew looked at me. What? I took out my phone and pulled up the photograph. Margaret's cramped, careful handwriting, the journal page she had written on a Sunday afternoon 4 years ago and never shown anyone. Matthew gives his whole heart too fast. I hope someday the person who receives it deserves it. Matthew stared at the screen for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face held something that had no single name. Grief and love, and the ache of being known completely by someone no longer there to know you in return. She wrote this before any of it happened. He said before she even knew to be worried. I said that was your mother. He pressed his fist briefly against his mouth. Then he lowered his hand and stood straight. See, I'm going to be okay, Dad, he said. Not the way I've been saying things are fine when they're not actually okay. He looked at me. It's going to take time, but I'm going to be okay. I believed him. I could see it, the particular quality of a person who has been through something that could have broken them and discovered on the other side that they are not broken, changed. More careful but intact in the ways that mattered. When Michael called me yesterday, Matthew added he almost smiled. Tyler, Unc's friend. He's been texting Tyler for my number for a week, too nervous to ask me directly. The almost smile became something fuller and real. Tyler finally just gave it to him. Something warm moved through my chest. Good, I said. We stayed a few more minutes. The frost caught the morning light and turned it to small points of silver. Somewhere in the fir branches above a Steller's jay called twice and went quiet. I put my hand flat on Margaret's headstone, cold granite under my palm, solid and permanent. I kept them both, I said quietly. The promises, both of them. I did not hear her answer, but I did not need to. The morning was clear and cold, and still my son was standing beside me, and the fir trees held us both in their long shadow. That was enough. That was everything. I am not a perfect father. I was absent for too many years, too consumed by work, too convinced that providing meant the same thing as being present. If there is one thing this revenge story taught me, it is this. The people who love you are watching. They are reading you the way you never think to read yourself. And sometimes the greatest gift they give you is the chance to finally show up when it matters most. Do not wait the way I waited. Do not let the silence between you and the people you love grow so wide that it takes a crisis to close it. God gave us instincts, and He gave us each other trust both while you still have time. I believe that real protection is not about money or property. It is about presence. It is about being the person your family can call at midnight, at a wedding in the worst moment of their lives, and knowing without question that you will answer. These grand pastries exist because families are complicated. Love is imperfect, and the people who hurt us are sometimes the people we never saw coming. But so are the people who save us. If this revenge story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what it meant to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story that matters. These grand pastries carry fictionalized elements built for reflection and education. If this content is not for you, step away freely and find what serves you better. Thank you for staying until the very end. Looking back on everything that happened, I realize now how deeply my years on the force shaped my response. As a former homicide detective, my brain was permanently wired to look for the hidden motives, the unseen connections, and the quiet discrepancies that ordinary people overlook. When I saw my son whispering to me at his own wedding, the instinct didn't just kick in. It took over completely. It reminded me of those long, cold nights sitting in a surveillance vehicle, drinking stale coffee, and waiting for a suspect to make a single mistake. I knew that Victoria and her accomplices were operating with a level of sophistication that most criminals lack, but they underestimated one critical factor. They targeted a family that knew how to fight back. We didn't just survive their scheme. We dismantled it piece by piece, using their own arrogance against them. And in the end, justice wasn't just served in a courtroom. It was reclaimed in the very lives they tried to destroy. I spent my whole career protecting strangers, but this time the case was personal. This time I was protecting my own blood, and there is absolutely nothing I wouldn't do to ensure my son's safety and future.